The room on the second floor was still warm when I opened the door. Not freshly lived in, but not cold either. The bed hadn't been slept in, and the shower hadn't been used, but the window was cracked open just an inch, letting in a draft sharp enough to sting my skin. On the sill, a paper coffee cup sat perfectly still. The snow outside was untouched, no footprints below, no tracks at all. If you've ever worked the night shift somewhere far from home, you'll understand this story. And if these keep you company at night, you're welcome to follow along so you won't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 at the time, living up in Grand County, Colorado, not far from the Wyoming border. I worked at a small ski lodge nestled halfway up the mountain, mostly weekend traffic skiers from Denver, or sometimes older couples on off-season retreats. The kind of place with creaky wooden floors, a working fireplace in every room, and more snow shovels than guests most of the year. This happened in early February of 2006. I'd been working there for about 5 years by then, mostly the late shifts, checking folks in, setting up early coffee, managing room requests. Len Turner handled maintenance. He was one of those guys who didn't talk much unless something needed fixing. Quiet, but reliable. I never thought I'd be grateful for someone like that until all this happened. That week, we were in the middle of one of those storms that comes in fast and doesn't let up. Heavy snow piling up from the early morning hours, wind gusting hard enough to rattle the upstairs vents. Most of our guests had canceled or rescheduled. By Tuesday afternoon, we were down to 3 occupied rooms and not expecting any new arrivals. At least, that's what the system showed. It was almost 6:30 in the evening when I noticed the man in the lobby. I hadn't heard the front door chime, and he wasn't there the last time I walked through. Just suddenly, sitting there on the couch in the reading nook, no snow on his coat, no suitcase. A tall man, maybe late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and those expressionless eyes you can't quite describe later. He wasn't doing anything odd, just sitting watching the fire. But there was something off about the way he held himself, like he was too still, too settled for someone who had just come in from a storm. I asked if I could help him, and he looked up at me like I'd interrupted something. Not annoyed, just surprised. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he nodded and said, "I'll take a room on the second floor. End of the hall." He didn't ask if we had availability, didn't request anything, just said it like he already knew. I told him we had rooms open and pulled up the check-in system. He paid in cash, exact change right down to the cents. When I asked for a name to put on the file, he just said, "No need. I'll be gone by morning. We have a policy that technically requires ID, but the roads were bad, and I figured he was just passing through, maybe stranded between towns." I gave him room 207. Keys were still physical back then, the kind with the green plastic tags. He took it without another word and disappeared up the staircase. For a while, I forgot about him. We weren't busy. I set out the cocoa mix in the lobby, turned on the fireplace in the lounge, went through the usual motions. Around 9:30, I passed Len in the back hallway. He looked up from the floor buffer and said, "You check in that guy upstairs?" "Yeah," I said. "Couple hours ago." Len just nodded. "Didn't hear him come in." I shrugged. "Me neither." Around 11:15 that night, I went to do the last rounds, just making sure lights were off, lobby doors were locked, thermostats set. When I passed room 207, I noticed something strange. The door was shut, but the little light underneath, barely visible, was flickering like a candle. I paused. All the lights in those rooms were electric. No fireplace in that one. No reason for a light to flicker like that. I figured maybe it was just the hallway bulb playing tricks, so I moved on. At midnight, the phone rang. It was the couple in room 203. The woman said she thought she heard someone pacing above them. I told her 207 was the last room at the end of the hall, no one above. She said, "Well, someone's walking. Slow, steady steps. It started about 20 minutes ago and hasn't stopped." I apologized, said I'd look into it. But when I went up, the hallway was dead quiet. No sound at all. I stood outside 207 for a good minute listening. Nothing, not even movement. I considered knocking, but something about the air in that hallway stopped me. It was colder than the rest of the building, not freezing, just enough to raise goosebumps. I walked back downstairs and made a note to follow up in the morning. By 7:00 a.m., the snow had stopped. Thick drifts covered the driveway, but you could see where the plow had been through. Len was already out back, clearing a path toward the service entrance. I started making coffee, waiting to see if the man would check out. By 9:00, there was still no sign of him, no movement. The front desk log showed no calls. So I grabbed the master key and went upstairs. Room 207 looked untouched from the outside, but when I pushed the key into the lock and turned the handle, something didn't sit right. The door opened smoothly, but the air that met me was stale. Not cold, but stale, as if the room hadn't been entered in days. Inside, the bed was perfectly made, no creases, no indentations. The toiletries were untouched, the light was off, but the window was cracked just an inch, and on the sill sat a paper coffee cup lid on steam long gone. And across the room, facing the window, was the chair, empty. I stepped in slowly. The floor creaked once beneath me. Nothing else. Then I noticed something strange. The carpet beneath the chair was slightly compressed, like someone had been sitting there for hours. But no footprints, not near the door, not near the window. I called down to Len and asked him to join me. He came up and stood just inside the room. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said, "Did he sleep in here?" I shook my head. Doesn't look like it. Len took a slow step toward the window and looked out. No tracks. I moved to the bathroom. The towels were still folded. The mirror was clean. Not a trace of water in the sink or shower. "He didn't use the room," I said quietly. Len looked over at me. "So, where did he go?" We checked the front door logs. Nothing. The security camera for the lobby had glitched around 3:12 a.m., frozen for about 9 minutes before resuming. I checked the tapes twice. In the still frame, you could just barely make out a shape sitting in the reading nook. Same chair, same angle, but no face. That afternoon, I tried calling the local bus station and sheriff's department to see if anyone matching his description had checked in or reported trouble. Nothing. No missing persons. No name to go by. For days after I kept that room closed, just something about it felt paused, like it hadn't really let go of him. It's been almost 20 years now. That lodge is still running, though I left the following year. But every so often I think about that chair still pressed into the carpet, and the window cracked just an inch. Just enough for something to leave or something to watch. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people think you're embellishing something, or worse, that you imagined it. But it happened. And even now, I still think about the man's face when I try to fall asleep. In 2016, I was working contract-based logistics for a software firm. Nothing glamorous, just overseeing equipment shipments and vendor access for conference setups. That spring, our team was handling a mid-level tech summit at a hotel near DFW. I'd flown in from Minneapolis a few days early to deal with some customs paperwork. My return flight wasn't until Sunday night. On the day everything happened, I remember the sky being strangely dark for noon, overcast with low clouds and that heavy quiet that sometimes comes before a storm. I was standing near gate C-18 waiting to board when the intercom chimed and a delay was announced. A mechanical issue, they said. They were moving our departure over to another gate C-31 with a different plane. No big deal. But when I arrived at C-31, something felt off immediately. There were no other passengers around. The screens all displayed flight info, but the gate agents were absent and the overhead lights were dimmed more than usual. I looked out the window and saw the plane parked outside. It looked wrong. Not damaged exactly, but unready. The forward cargo bay door was slightly open. The fuselage was smudged in places like it had been wiped down in a hurry, but not thoroughly. I stood there for a good minute, wondering if I'd misunderstood the gate change. Then the door behind the counter beeped and slid open. A woman in uniform stepped out holding a tablet. She looked at me, then at the screen, then nodded slightly like she'd expected me. No smile, no greeting. She just said, "Boarding now," and gestured toward the ramp. That should have been my second red flag. Inside the jet bridge, the air felt colder. And not just from the AC, it had that damp, metallic smell like old pipes or a swimming pool filter. When I stepped onto the plane, I noticed right away that it was nearly empty. Only a handful of people were seated, all spaced out like they'd deliberately avoided each other. I found my seat, 14A window, and tried not to overthink it. Maybe it was just a strange day. Maybe this was a backup plane from the hangars, and they were rushing to keep the schedule. I pulled out my book and tried to ignore the feeling that something was slightly wrong with the geometry of the cabin. The rows didn't line up perfectly. The lighting overhead flickered faintly every so often like the bulbs were mismatched. Then I noticed the man 2 rows ahead of me. Not doing anything, just sitting completely motionless. His head was tilted slightly toward the window, but he wasn't looking out. His arms were resting in his lap, palms up. No phone, no magazine, no tray, table, down. Just still. That wouldn't be noteworthy in itself. People zone out on flights all the time. But after about 20 minutes of us just sitting there, no announcements, no further boarding, no sound except for that soft mechanical hum. Planes always have. I glanced up again and realized the man hadn't moved once. Not an inch, not even to blink. I watched him for a few seconds longer than I meant to. Something about the angle of his shoulders didn't look right. They were too square, too even, like he'd been placed there rather than having settled into the seat naturally. Eventually, I stood up and pretended to stretch just to get a better look at the other passengers. Most were seated with heads down. One man was scrolling endlessly through his phone. A woman near the front had earbuds in and was staring straight ahead, not blinking. But no one looked concerned. No one looked like they noticed anything strange at all. I made my way toward the front of the cabin, planning to ask the attendant how much longer it would be. But when I got to the galley area, there was no one there. No coffee pots, no carts, just the metal frame of the service area and the soft flickering of a single overhead bulb. I leaned slightly toward the cockpit door, half expecting to hear muffled voices or the static of the intercom. Nothing. Just silence. That's when I noticed the armrest on seat 1D. It had a stain on it, something dark, almost black, not fresh, but old, crusted around the edge and flaking like rust. My stomach tightened. I turned to head back to my seat. The man 2 rows ahead of me was still there, still perfectly still, but now his head had shifted slightly. Not turning, not looking at me directly, just angled half an inch more toward the aisle. Enough to be noticeable. Enough to feel like acknowledgement. I sat back down and kept my eyes forward. I was no longer sure if I was on a delayed flight or something else entirely. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Still no takeoff. Still no movement. Finally, I stood and walked back up the aisle again, determined this time to leave the plane. I wasn't panicking, not yet, but I felt a rising pressure in my chest that made the air feel thinner. When I reached the galley, the cockpit door was still shut, but the flight attendant had returned. She was standing in the exact same spot as before, holding her tablet, as if she'd never moved. Her mouth opened like she was about to say something, and then didn't. I asked, "Is there another delay?" She blinked slowly, then nodded. I asked, "Can I disembark?" Her eyes flicked toward the cabin, then back to me. Finally, she said, "You can exit if you wish, but you'll still arrive." That phrase didn't make any sense. I stood there uncertain how to respond. Then I backed slowly down the aisle and returned to my seat, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. I stared at the seat back ahead of me, trying to ground myself in something real. Then I noticed it. The window across the aisle was showing a different time of day. Out my own window, the tarmac was still gray and dim, but through the opposite one, the sky was bright like early morning sunlight on concrete. That was it. I unbuckled, stood, and moved fast. I didn't care anymore how it looked. I walked straight down the aisle, past the motionless man in 12C, past the woman who hadn't blinked in 20 minutes, and stepped into the jet bridge. It was empty, not quiet, not hushed, but empty. The lighting had shifted again. A faint reddish hue now tinged the corridor. I walked as quickly as I could, resisting the urge to break into a run. When I reached the terminal, the signage had changed. The screen that had once shown my flight number now displayed static flickering through digits too fast to read. A janitor sweeping nearby glanced at me and asked if I'd gotten off the plane that just taxied in. I said yes, and he nodded like that made sense. But here's the part I still don't understand. When I finally made it back to the front lobby and checked the flight board, there was no record of my original gate. No flight listed to Minneapolis that day. When I showed my boarding pass to a clerk at the help desk, she told me the flight had been canceled early that morning due to mechanical failure hours before I ever arrived at the airport. I asked if she could check another system. She tried and then looked at me carefully. "Sir, we don't have any record of that gate being in service today." I ended up staying overnight at a nearby hotel and catching a commercial flight home the next morning. I didn't try to explain the details to anyone, not to my coworkers, not even to my wife. But a few days later, I was looking through a news archive from earlier that year. I don't know why, just a feeling. That's when I found it. A small commuter aircraft had crashed during a test taxi run in March. No passengers. A mechanical misfire had sent it careening into the perimeter fence. The report listed the gate as C-31. That wouldn't be strange, except for one detail buried in the photo accompanying the article. The tail number on the wreckage matched the one on my boarding pass, and standing in the background, partially obscured by the frame, was a man in a dark coat seated near the edge of the torn fuselage. His posture was familiar. His hands were folded. And even through the grainy quality of the image, I recognized the angle of his head. He wasn't looking at the wreckage. He was looking straight into the camera. I haven't told many people this, not because I'm ashamed or trying to protect anyone, but because I still don't quite understand what the goal was, or what it would have looked like if it had worked. Back in 2020, I was living alone in a duplex near the edge of Scottsdale. Quiet area, mostly retired couples and snowbirds. I worked about 20 minutes away at a veterinary clinic just off the 101, where I split my days between the front desk and assisting with dental cleanings. The schedule was long but predictable. I left around 7:45 every morning and usually got back home by 6 unless there was an emergency surgery. At the time, I had just cut off contact with a woman named Melody. We'd been close, not just casual friends, but the kind who spent birthdays and holidays together, the kind who knew each other's passwords and worst decisions. I'd met her during college orientation. She was one of those people who seemed magnetic at first, funny, impulsive, the kind who could talk anyone into anything. But over the years, that charm wore thin. There were small lies, emotional games, drama that always ended in her playing the victim. When I finally drew a line and stopped responding to her texts, she didn't take it well. That was in early January. By the end of the month, I thought things had settled. But one Tuesday afternoon, while I was in the middle of holding a golden retriever, still during a nail trim, my phone started buzzing non-stop in the pocket of my scrubs. When I finally stepped outside to check it, I had 8 missed calls. 3 from my mother, 1 from my landlord, and several from a number I didn't recognize. The voicemails were all variations of the same question. Are you okay? Why are people saying you're missing? Have you been reported to the police? I remember standing there behind the clinic, the sun baking into the concrete, not understanding what was happening. I hadn't posted anything online in days. I hadn't spoken to Melody since the last cold text I sent saying I need space. Please don't contact me anymore. When I got home that evening, the first thing I did was check my building's Facebook group. That's where I saw the post. Melody had written a long, emotional message claiming I had been missing for 4 days. She said she was terrified for my safety and had already spoken to authorities. The post included a picture of me from 2 years earlier cropped, so I looked pale and a little gaunt, and listed a bunch of outdated details, including the make and model of a car I'd sold months ago. The comments were full of concern, people offering to help. One woman said she thought she'd seen me walking near the Fry's on Thomas Road and would keep an eye out. Another claimed I'd left a note on her windshield once and asked if it was connected. It felt surreal, like watching a fictional version of myself unravel in real time. I went to the police the next morning, not to press charges, just to clear things up. Officer Green, who took my statement, was polite, but clearly skeptical at first. I had to show him my time card, work ID, and even the security camera footage from the clinic to prove I'd been present the whole week. After about half an hour, he asked if I had any idea who might have done this. I gave him Melody's name. He raised his eyebrows like maybe that had been his guess too. "Did you know she filed a welfare check request 3 nights ago?" he said. "No," I told him. "I haven't spoken to her in weeks. She said you hadn't answered your phone in days, claimed you were unstable and might be a danger to yourself." That part sat with me for a long time, because she knew exactly how to phrase it, how to sound concerned, not vindictive, how to raise alarm without ever saying something that could be proven false. He asked if I wanted to file a report for harassment. I said no, at least not yet. I just wanted it to stop, but it didn't. A few nights later, I was in my kitchen around 9:30 finishing dishes when I heard a knock at the door. Not urgent, just steady. I peeked through the peephole and saw my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, from Unit 3B. She looked confused. "I didn't mean to bother you," she said when I opened the door, "but your friend said you were out of town, and I just saw you through the window, so I thought I asked her what friend." She hesitated, then described a woman who fit Melody's build. Said she'd come by that afternoon asking if I'd left a spare key because she was doing a wellness check. Apparently, she'd told Ms. Rodriguez that I had recently started acting strange and might be missing again. That night, I took my car around the block twice before pulling into the driveway just to be sure no one was following me. I closed all the blinds, turned off every light I didn't need, and checked the locks twice before going to bed. The next day, I went through my phone and blocked every number Melody had ever used. I deleted our old message threads, but not before backing them up to a flash drive, just in case. Still, the digital trail kept growing. She created a second Facebook post this time, tagging a local missing persons advocacy group. She used a different photo, one where I was blinking mid-shot, which made me look zoned out, and wrote a long caption about mental health red flags. The comments were even worse this time. People speculating that I was in danger, that I'd relapsed, that I was being controlled by someone and couldn't reach out. I started getting messages from strangers. People saying they hoped I got help. One man asked if I was being held somewhere and needed a place to stay. That's when I decided to contact a lawyer. And with his help, I finally filed a formal restraining order. When officers served her the paperwork, she apparently broke down crying in her driveway. Told them she was just trying to help a friend. They let her go with a warning. And that was the last I saw of her in person anyway. But 2 weeks later, I found something strange. I had a smart doorbell installed, one of those with motion-triggered recording. I'd had it for months, but rarely reviewed the footage unless I got a package. That night, for no particular reason, I checked the archive. And there she was, 3:17 a.m., on a Tuesday, just standing there, not knocking, not trying the handle, just standing on the porch, looking up at the camera with her hands clasped in front of her, like she was waiting for someone to answer. She stood there for nearly 3 minutes, then turned and walked off into the night. I downloaded the clip and gave a copy to the police, who updated the file, but didn't make an arrest. They said she hadn't broken any laws, just been on public property. I moved out of that duplex a month later. Changed jobs, changed numbers. moved across the state line, and didn't leave a forwarding address. But even now, when I get a wrong number text or a friend request from someone I don't recognize, I feel that flicker of anxiety in my chest. Because if she ever decides to try again, she already knows how to make people listen. And by the time anyone questions the story, I might be the one they don't believe. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people question if you're remembering it right, or worse, if you're making it up. It happened back in 2017. I was living alone in a little rental duplex on the edge of Stillwater, the kind of place with stained carpets and a furnace that rattled when it kicked on. I worked night shifts as a nurse practitioner at the urgent care clinic off Perkins Road, mostly minor stuff, but the hours were long, and it wasn't uncommon for me to grab a bite to eat on my way home just to wind down before sleep. There was a 24-hour diner I went to a lot back then. Dee's, it was called. Not exactly charming cracked vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that buzzed a little too loud, but it was open, and the food was always hot. I knew the night cook Curtis well enough to wave to him when I walked in. Most nights it was just me and a couple of old-timers drinking coffee until sunrise. But this one morning, it must have been just after 5:00 a.m. I walked in and noticed someone new sitting at the far end of the counter. Middle-aged man, maybe early 40s, wearing a windbreaker and khakis, no coat despite it being cold out. He didn't look at me when I entered, just kept stirring a spoon slowly through his black coffee over and over, even though it was clear nothing was in it. I picked a booth a few seats away, ordered my usual eggs and rye toast, and tried to decompress. My shift had been quiet, but I was tired and the harsh lighting made everything feel a little surreal. Curtis dropped off my plate with a nod, and I started eating. A few minutes passed in silence, until I noticed the man turning slightly toward me. Then he said very calmly, "You're Natalie." I looked up, startled because I hadn't said a word since coming in. "No," I replied, "I'm Rachel." He tilted his head like he didn't quite hear me. "You always ordered the cinnamon French toast when we came here." I hadn't ordered that in years. Not since nursing school. I shook my head slowly. "I think you've got me confused with someone else." But he smiled at me, not creepy, not threatening. Just familiar. Too familiar. "You got that scar on your left knee from the lake house when you were 11, he said. "You tripped on the firewood rack. Your brother tried to blame the dog." I froze, fork in midair. That was true. Every word of it. And I hadn't told that story in over a decade. I looked at him closer. His eyes were this flat shade of hazel, the kind you might pass by on the street and forget immediately. His voice didn't spark any recognition either. I didn't know this man. I was certain of that. "I think you should leave me alone," I said quietly. My hands were starting to shake. He didn't move, didn't argue. Just nodded, took a sip from his coffee, and turned back to face the counter. I sat there for another minute, trying to collect myself, then grabbed my purse and walked out without finishing my breakfast. I didn't look back, but I could feel him watching through the window as I crossed the parking lot. I didn't sleep well that day. The next night, I didn't go to Dee's. I drove to the next town over and picked up drive-through instead. I told myself he was just a weird guy, maybe confused, maybe unwell. Still, I checked the locks 3 times before bed. But 2 nights later, after another long shift, I went back. Habit, maybe. Or maybe I just didn't want to feel like he'd chased me off. Dee's was half full when I got there, but he wasn't inside. I picked my usual booth. Curtis gave me a cautious look as he refilled my coffee. "That guy from the other night," he said under his breath, "he asked you something strange." "Yeah," I said, a little surprised. "Why?" Curtis glanced over his shoulder toward the kitchen. "He came back that morning, after you left, asked for a to-go order, then just stood by the pie case staring at the door like he was waiting on someone." "Did he say anything else?" I asked. Curtis hesitated. "Said he used to come here with a girl named Natalie, that she liked the corner booth, but that wasn't her anymore. Like maybe she'd changed." That chilled me more than the first conversation, because I hadn't said the name Natalie. Not out loud. I left early again that night, drove the long way home, parked with my lights off for a few seconds before getting out just to see if anyone was nearby. The next day, I called the police. Officer Lane came by that afternoon. She was friendly but practical, the kind of cop who'd seen 100 weird stories and didn't dismiss any of them outright. I gave her a description of the man, what he'd said, what I remembered. "Did he threaten you?" she asked. "No," I said. But it felt wrong, like he knew me but also didn't. She filed a report but didn't seem hopeful anything would come of it. Unless he came back and caused trouble, there wasn't much they could do. The next time I saw him was 2 weeks later. Not at the diner, but in the parking lot of my apartment complex. It was just after midnight. I had parked and was walking toward the stairwell when I saw someone standing near the dumpsters. At first, I assumed it was a neighbor or someone taking trash out late, but then he stepped into the glow of the overhead light. Same windbreaker, same stillness. He didn't say anything this time, just watched me walk to the stairs. I tried not to run, but I climbed faster than usual, locked the door behind me, heart pounding, and called the police again. By the time they arrived, he was gone. They patrolled the lot, checked the bushes, even talked to a couple neighbors. But no one else had seen anything. No cameras, no plates, no name. After that, I changed my routine. Took my lunch breaks in the back office instead of leaving the clinic. Didn't go back to Dee's, bought blackout curtains, turned off my location services. Weeks passed, nothing else happened. Until one afternoon my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a single sentence. "You were Natalie once. You'll remember eventually." I blocked the number, reported it, but the words lingered echoing in a part of my brain I didn't like to visit. The idea that someone out there believed I used to be someone else and that he knew things no stranger should, it still wakes me up some nights. I don't know what he wanted or who he thought I was, but part of me wonders if Natalie was real, and if so, what happened to her. I worked the night shift out on Highway 285 for years, and I used to think I'd seen just about every kind of weird the road could throw at you. Sleepwalkers filling up in pajamas, truckers talking to people who weren't there. A guy once came in barefoot asking if we had oil for his chainsaw. No car, no explanation. But what stayed with me, what still pulls at me when I drive past that old gas station, was the man in the blue hoodie who came in every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. and bought $12 of gas. No more, no less. Let me back up. I was 38 when it started, divorced, low on options, working nights for a fuel chain that serviced truckers, ranchers, and the occasional lost tourist coming up from Taos. The store sat just outside Alamosa, a long, flat stretch where the mountains are far in the distance and the wind doesn't stop howling in winter. We had 3 pumps, dusty tile floors, and a radio that only played 2 stations, one country, one Christian, both of them cutting in and out like bad reception on a cassette. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights were quiet after midnight. A lot of staring out into the dark, a lot of counting the buzzing of the beer cooler. Then one night around the start of November, I noticed the guy. He pulled in right at 3:17, not 3:15, not 3:20. It was always 3:17 to the minute like clockwork. Beat-up white sedan looked like a Ford Taurus, maybe late 90s, blue hoodie, face mostly hidden by the shadow of the car roof. He'd pump exactly $12 of gas, come inside, drop a 20 on the counter, never said a word. Just waited for me to count out $8 in change and nod. Then he'd leave. No snacks, no smokes, just gas, then gone. The first time I didn't think much of it. Maybe a guy on a strict budget. Maybe something about how far he needed to get each night. But it was the exactness of it that started to bother me. Same pump, same amount, same time, every single night. I started watching the clock without meaning to. It would hit 3:14, and I'd glance out the window waiting. And sure enough, the headlights would roll over the gravel, pulling in like they'd never left. Always 3:17. After about a week, I mentioned it to the day manager, Claire. She just shrugged and said maybe he was a shift worker too, maybe on a delivery loop. She didn't care as long as the register balanced. But something about it scratched at the back of my brain. We weren't near any big warehouses or overnight routes, and that car, it didn't look like it could make a loop that tight night after night without breaking down eventually. A few nights later, I tried watching the guy closer. I stepped outside as he pulled up. It was below freezing frost, already forming on the pumps. He kept his head down the whole time, hoodie pulled tight like he didn't want to be seen. I said something casual. "Cold night, huh?" And he paused for half a second like he hadn't expected to be spoken to. Then he nodded barely and got back in the car. The brake lights flicked on, then faded into the dark. After that, I got curious, started writing it down. The time, the pump number, the car make, everything I could observe. It wasn't like I had much else to do between midnight and dawn. And sure enough, the pattern never broke. $12, pump 2, 3:17 a.m. The receipt always printed with the same timestamp. Until the night, it didn't. That night I looked up at 3:14 like usual, but no headlights came. I waited. 3:17 passed. 3:20. Still nothing. I even stepped outside like maybe I'd missed the sound. But the road was dead quiet. Just the wind in the sagebrush and that low hum the fluorescents make when they're starting to go. Then at 3:46, the car pulled in. Same beat-up Ford, same hoodie, but something was off. He sat in the car for a full minute before opening the door. When he got out, I could see he was limping not badly, but enough that it looked stiff, like something had happened. He didn't go to the pump right away this time. He came straight to the door, and for the first time, he looked directly at me through the glass. His face was wrong somehow. Not grotesque or wounded, just wrong. His eyes didn't track right, like they were a second behind everything else. His mouth twitched once, then settled into something like a smirk, though it didn't seem aimed at me. I remember thinking he looked like a man who'd already heard the punchline to a joke I didn't know was coming. He walked in slower than usual and placed the 20 on the counter like always. But he didn't say a word, just stood there watching. I counted out 8 in change, set it beside the bill. He didn't reach for it. After maybe 30 seconds, he turned and left, didn't pump any gas at all, just got in his car and drove off into the dark. The next night, he didn't come at all. I kept watching, kept writing it down. The car never returned. Not at 3:17, not at 3:46, not at any time. A few days later, I called the regional dispatcher and asked if they had a patrol car nearby who might have seen something odd around that time. The trooper who came by was polite enough, listened to my story, even looked at the notes I'd scribbled. But when I gave him the license plate, I'd memorized it after the 5th night, he went quiet. He asked me to repeat it. Then he stepped outside to radio it in. He came back 10 minutes later, face unreadable, and said there must be a mistake. That plate belonged to a vehicle that had been totaled in 2015, just outside Salida single-car accident, no survivors. He even showed me the report. I asked him if there was any way the number had been reassigned. He just looked at me for a second and said, "Not with the old Colorado plates. Once they're retired, they're done. I don't know what happened that night at 3:46. I don't know if the guy was real or if I imagined the whole routine. But here's the part that still bothers me. A week after that last visit, I found a $20 bill tucked behind the coffee filters under the counter. Neat, crisp, new. Wrapped inside it was a torn receipt from our pump, too. Time-stamped, 3:17 a.m. Date, the day after the last time I saw him. But I was there that night. I never saw a car pull in. And I know I never printed that receipt. I don't usually talk about this. Most people are already uncomfortable when I tell them I used to work in a funeral home. It's not the kind of job that comes up in casual conversation, and even when it does, folks tend to change the subject or offer a quick, polite nod before shifting their weight and looking away. But I didn't mind the work. It was quiet, structured, and respectful. You learn a lot about people in those spaces, what they wear, to say goodbye, how long they linger, which ones can't bear to look. What happened that day wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just wrong, in a way I can't shake. The chapel was in the back wing of the building, long and narrow, with dark blue carpet and polished oak pews that creaked just slightly when someone shifted their weight. I remember the soft hiss of the overhead fluorescents and the smell of old hymnals and waxy carnations. That morning we had a small service for a man named Donald Elbridge, mid-60s, former plumber family man. Not many attendees, just his daughter, her husband, and an elderly cousin. They stayed through the short reading and left without much ceremony, thanking Mr. Halverson on their way out. My job was always the same. After the guests left, I'd go back in, straighten the hymnals, remove any tissues or programs left behind, and prep the room for whatever came next. Only that day, as I walked toward the chapel, I saw someone coming out. At first, I thought it was one of the family members who'd just forgotten something. But when he turned and walked past me, I felt this weird flicker of recognition, except I was sure I'd never seen him before. He was wearing a gray suit that looked just slightly off. Not old-fashioned exactly, but like something from another decade, wide lapels, crisp pleats, shoes that looked polished to the point of artificial. He didn't acknowledge me. No nod, no eye contact. Just walked down the hallway and exited through the main lobby as if he knew the layout better than I did. I poked my head into the chapel, thinking maybe someone else had come back with him, but the room was empty. No noise, no movement, no indication anyone else had entered since the family left. I glanced at the doors leading to the staff corridor, still locked from the inside as they always were. There's only one entrance to that chapel from the public hallway, and I had been walking toward it the whole time. When I mentioned it to Mr. Halverson later, he barely reacted, just said something like, "Oh, maybe a late visitor. Happens sometimes." But I could tell he was brushing it off. I'd worked there for almost a year. Visitors didn't just happen, not without signing in, not without being announced, and definitely not without being noticed by the receptionist at the front desk. I checked with her that afternoon, and she looked confused when I asked. "No, I didn't see anyone come in after the service," she said. "Are you sure?" I was sure. I even remembered the click of the man's shoes on the linoleum, the slight squeak of the lobby door as he pushed it open. I could describe his suit, the exact gray-blue of it, the way his hair was neatly combed back like he was going to a wedding or a job interview. I could even recall how cold the hallway suddenly felt when he passed me. Not a drop in temperature exactly. It was more like the air around him didn't belong to the building. Later that evening, just before closing, I went to tidy the front guest book. Most people don't sign it anymore, but some still do, older folks mostly, or people who believe in the courtesy of it. I flipped through the last page out of habit, scanning for familiar names. One entry near the bottom stood out not because of what it said, but because of how it looked. The handwriting was sharp, too sharp, almost like it had been printed mechanically with a fountain pen. It said, "J. Caro, 3:12 p.m. The service had ended by 2:45. Everyone had left by 3. I hadn't seen anyone come in after that, except the man in the gray suit, and the name wasn't familiar. It wasn't on the obituary, wasn't mentioned by the daughter, and didn't match any of the names in the Elbridge family. I brought the book to Mr. Halverson, thinking maybe it was someone from the funeral industry who knew the deceased professionally, but he just stared at it for a while and then closed the cover gently. "That name comes up every now and then," he said, almost too casually. "Usually around late services. Nothing to worry about. That should have been the end of it. But curiosity has a way of lingering, especially in quiet places like ours." A few nights later, I stayed behind after hours. We weren't hosting another service, so the building was mostly dark. I sat near the chapel entrance with the lobby lights dimmed, pretending to do paperwork, but really just listening. Around 3:00 a.m., I heard it again, that same soft squeak of the lobby door, followed by the sharp, rhythmic click of shoes. I stepped into the hall, but no one was there. Nothing moved. No doors had opened, and the front security monitor didn't show a single shadow crossing the main entrance. I found a blank line in the guest book the next morning. Same handwriting, same name, same time. We never caught anything on the cameras. Mr. Halverson said not to dwell on it. "Not everything in this line of work has an explanation," he told me once, while adjusting the collar on a display mannequin. "Some people come late. Some people never leave." I left that job the following spring. It wasn't one thing that pushed me out, but more, a gradual weight that never seemed to lift. like I was always being watched just before closing, like certain rooms always held just a little too much quiet. But every so often, usually around 3 to 12 in the morning, I think about that man walking out of the viewing room, about the suit, the sound of his shoes on old linoleum. And I wonder how many guest books across the country hold that same signature, quiet, precise, and never quite accounted for. I used to work nights as a cab driver in Kansas City. Most people assumed that meant steady business from bar crowds and hotel fares, but truthfully, the money was just average. The real trade-off was quiet. I liked having the roads mostly to myself, the way the industrial district seemed to turn into a forgotten city after midnight. The warehouses went dark, the streets emptied, and sometimes it felt like I was the only one still awake. That sense of quiet always felt like a gift, until the night I picked up the last passenger who ever truly unsettled me. It was mid-November, clear, but cold. The kind of night where frost formed along the edges of my windshield between runs. Around 2 in the morning, I got a call from dispatch for a pickup near a cluster of old brick factories. That was unusual. No one lived there anymore, at least not legally, and most of the businesses had moved out years ago. Still, I drove out, telling myself it was probably a worker from one of the overnight cleaning crews. The streetlights in that part of town worked about half the time, so I was navigating long shadows between faint orange pools of light. When I pulled up to the intersection, I saw him standing under a flickering bulb, his hands clasped in front of him like he'd been waiting a long time. He was dressed simply, a dark coat buttoned all the way up, trousers pressed too neatly for the setting, and shoes that caught the light like they'd just been polished. Something about the formality of it felt out of place in the empty street. He opened the back door without a word and slid in. Most passengers at least mutter a greeting or give you an address right away, but he just sat there very still, eyes forward. I turned slightly and asked where he was headed. His answer came a beat late, as though he had to remind himself of the place. "By the river," he said. His voice was quiet even, and I noticed he didn't name a street or landmark, just that vague direction. I started driving west, trying to coax more details out of him. Which bridge? Which part of the riverfront? But he only repeated the same phrase. By the river each time, like that was enough. I stole glances at him through the rearview mirror. He didn't fidget, didn't look at his phone, didn't seem to focus on anything at all. Just sat with his hands folded, breathing slow and shallow. After a few minutes, I decided to stop at a gas station to get clarity. I pulled into the lot under the bright halogen lights, figuring maybe he'd be more comfortable naming a specific place when we weren't rolling through empty streets. The clerk behind the counter gave me a puzzled look as I walked in. When I asked her if she'd seen my passenger come in before she tilted her head. "What passenger?" she asked. I glanced back through the glass doors. The cab sat idling where I'd left it, the back seat visible in the glare of the lights. I could see the dark shape of the man motionless exactly where he had been. Relief washed over me. He was still there, which meant I wasn't imagining things. But the clerk's confusion lingered, and when I pressed her, she just shook her head. "You pulled up alone. I didn't see anybody get out." When I stepped back outside, the man finally spoke again. "Not here," he said, his voice carrying evenly through the glass as I opened the door. "Keep driving." It sent a ripple through me because I hadn't told him why I stopped, and yet he seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. I pulled out of the lot and continued west. The streets grew narrower, quieter, until I could hear the faint hum of the river itself through the half-cracked window. He sat forward slightly now, as if straining toward something ahead. I slowed near an old access road that led down to the water. It hadn't been used in years, the gate rusted open and weeds pushing through the cracks in the pavement. "Here," he whispered. I eased to a stop. The road dead-ended near the flood wall, nothing but dark water beyond. When I turned my head to ask if this was really it, the back seat was empty. No sound of a door closing. No shift in weight, just absence. I threw the car in park and looked around wildly, but the lot stretched empty on both sides. The river lapped quietly at the retaining wall, the air biting cold against my face as I stepped out. I stayed there for what felt like several minutes, scanning the waterline and the shadows near the flood wall. No one. No footsteps leading away. Nothing but the quiet slap of water and the occasional groan of the bridge farther upstream. When I finally forced myself back into the driver's seat, the rearview mirror seemed darker than usual, like it wasn't reflecting enough of the world behind me. I didn't file a report that night. What could I have said? That a man vanished from my cab without opening the door, that he asked me to drive to a place that didn't exist on any fare map. The following afternoon, I did mention it to another driver while we swapped shifts. He gave me a long look and said he'd heard of something similar before. A passenger by the river, always alone, always vanishing before the end of the ride. Some drivers refused that call from dispatch if it came up on their screen. I never drove that part of the city again after dark. Thinking back on it now, I realize most of these stories I've shared don't have sharp endings. They don't resolve with answers that make sense or clean lines that close the book. They leave space like an unfinished sentence, and maybe that's why they follow me into the years long after they happened. A quiet hotel hallway, a diner parking lot, a late-night passenger. None of those places should matter, but they stay fixed in memory because something in them was off by just enough to make me notice. If there's a thread through all of this, it's that the strange things rarely happen where we expect them. They don't wait in haunted houses or abandoned asylums. They slip in through the ordinary, through the shift you almost didn't take the road you weren't supposed to drive. The room that felt too still. They remind you that sometimes the world looks back when you least expect it. And the truth is, most of us never realize when we've stepped into one of those moments until it's too late to step out. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I hope these stories kept you company tonight, wherever you're listening from. If you'd like to hear more, please consider subscribing, sharing this with someone who enjoys quiet, unsettling tales, and joining me for future nights. And tell me, have you ever had a late-night encounter that never quite left your memory?